Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 622 through 624, which will cover manga chapters 696 through 698. And we are now pretty much at the end of the Punk Hazard arc, but there is still a lot of excitement and emotions packed into this set of episodes. So, synopsis. With everyone safely out of the lab, everyone goes into banquet mode as they celebrate their victory along with taking care of the injured and sick. It's then decided that the kids will be taken home by Tashigi, while the Straw Hats, the Samurai, and Law will make their way towards Dressrosa, but Smoker and the remaining G5 soldiers on Punk Hazard are in for a terrifying surprise with the arrival of the Shichibukai Doflamingo. Alright, so differences. There are quite a few in these episodes, so first off, there's a couple added scenes of Sanji and Brook building the stove. This was not in the manga, as well as we actually explicitly get to see Brook accidentally knock over Kinemon's encased body and then subsequently setting him free. We also get a really great scene where we actually see Tashigi asking and convincing Nami to hand over the care of the children to her. In the manga, we only get a brief one-panel flashback of Tashigi asking Nami, but nothing else. And later on, during the scene where she explains to Usopp that she entrusts the kids to Tashigi, that's when we get to see that flashback as opposed to seeing it in a completely different scene beforehand. Another scene that gets added in is we see scenes of Chopper witnessing Law working with the kids before he freaks out. And then in the manga, it cuts right to already Chopper freaking out and screaming at Luffy. Additionally, we also get a follow-up to this scene in the anime later, Chopper apologizing to Law and offering him some soup. Both these scenes are not in the anime, only the scene where Chopper freaks out and starts screaming to Luffy. That's the part that's in the manga. I like these two additions, to be honest. It doesn't really change much, but it adds a little bit more context to what's happening. An interesting change was when Law says the chances of taking Kaido in the flashback is very low in the anime, but in the manga, he actually specifically states that it'll be 30%. So, yeah, I don't know why they changed this, to be honest. It doesn't really change much, but I guess they wanted to give themselves a little bit more breathing room, even though I guess it doesn't matter really because there's no real way to quantify this. But I did find it interesting that the anime decided to take away the specificity of the 30% and then make it just a general low percent in the anime. Another change is there's a scene where Robin asks where the Mary is, and Frankie responds that she was the fifth person who asked. This was added in the anime, and for fun, I wanted to kind of give my opinion on who I thought the other four people were at the time, and I did try and remember who I thought. But this is, I think, what my original sort of predictions were. The obvious one for me was Usopp. I'd say the second most likely one was a Chopper to me. And then the other two were a bit harder, but I think I remember I ultimately landed on Sanji being the third one, given how caring he is. And then the last member, I think might surprise you, but I actually thought it was Luffy. He seems a little of an odd choice considering he's always kind of aloof, but I do think he really cares about his entire crew and including the Mary. And so, yeah, that's a little odd choice considering, him, but I think it was a good one. But yeah, I'd love to hear who your initial thoughts were on the four that asked about the Mary. Of course, we get the answer to this in the very next episode, which is also an added scene. And turns out the right answer was, in order, Luffy being the first, Usopp being the second, Zoro being the third, and Nami being the fourth, which actually makes sense since these are the four that have known Mary since the very beginning. They were there on Syrup Village when they got Mary. So yeah, it makes sense that these four are the ones that care about Mary the most. I was surprised about Zoro though. I thought for sure that he'd be like the last person to ask. Now, one of the biggest changes they made in this section of episodes is the fact that the manga pretty much gives Doflamingo's Devil Fruit powers away at this point. I know it's pretty much hinted in the anime as well, and this scene is very different as far as it's more violent in the manga because you see Doflamingo actually slash up the soldiers with his string powers instead of using them to control the soldiers and making them shoot each other. The manga actually lets you see the strings for the first time, confirming what most of us thought for the longest time is that he had some sort of a string-based power or a puppetry-based power. And along those same lines, in the anime, Smoker and Doflamingo actually get a real fight, sort of, while in the manga we don't get to see this at all. Additionally, the anime makes it look like Smoker lost this fight trying to protect his men, but in the manga, he just loses instantly. Lastly, a couple more minor changes. In the anime, it has Robin asking Law who he was talking to over the Dendenmushi, but in the manga, it was Luffy who asked, which seems like an odd change, but I don't really mind it. The last kind of big change, I suppose, is during Law's explanation of the circumstances in the anime. It's missing the moment where Momo and Kinemon has sort of a shocked reaction to their next plans as they're out to get Doflamingo and they're headed to Dressrosa, which we will get in the next episode. Alright, so with those out of the way, let's get into the episodes themselves. So everything's now been more or less settled. Everyone is now getting treated while the Marines have drawn this line to separate them. But later there is an incredibly heartfelt meaning behind this line and why the G5 guys felt they needed this line, which I will get into a little bit later. Brownbeard is going to be taken in by the Marines, and I like this because Brownbeard has still done bad things. Even if he's since reformed a little bit, he still needs to atone for those crimes, but he views it as something he needs, and also the promise of further medical care from the Marines will help them, as well with all the experimentations done to him, as well as his crew. Speaking of medical care, we get a great scene where Tashigi begs Nami to hand over the care of the children to her, and I like that they expanded upon this scene in the anime because, like I mentioned in the differences section, this scene was more or less absent from the manga, and we actually don't know how Nami reacted. And we see that Nami was pretty apprehensive about giving the kids back to the Marines, but we see how she was convinced by Tashigi instead of just seeing her after this conversation has already taken place during her conversation with Usopp later on, which is another scene that I loved, and I'll circle back around to the result of this in a moment. Now, going back, we get this scene where Brook accidentally knocks over the gas-encrusted Kinemon and breaks him apart, but somehow he's alive? This is one of the worst examples of Oda's terrible fake-out deaths. The other ones have some form of plausibility, even Pell, although not really. But this one, for the life of me, I can't understand how the hell Kinemon is still alive. I suppose you could say that the gas just encase them and put them in some sort of a paralysis or stasis, but that's a huge leap because if they breathed any of this gas in, wouldn't it have also solidified their throats and lungs too? The other way you could look at this, I suppose, is that this is yet another example of a failed experiment by Caesar. Like he's constantly trying to prop himself up as this genius scientist, but everything he's done has been somewhat of a failure, or at the very least inferior to Vegapunk, leading us to assume that this was yet another failed invention by Caesar due to his incompetence, like we've seen throughout the arc, that all of his experiments and inventions have some sort of a flaw in it. And this explanation is also pretty unsatisfactory to me as well, though. In the end, this is just really bad writing on Oda's part, I think, that essentially undercuts all the tension and emotional stakes that was created with the gas during the arc. This is definitely one of the worst examples of Oda's fake-out deaths undercutting the story for the sake of not wanting to kill anyone. At this point, though, we should all be used to this, but it does lead to a pretty chaotically funny scene with Sanji, Brook, and Luffy all freaking out, especially that line thrown in there where Luffy's panicked suggestion is, couldn't we just stick all the pieces back together? And Sanji's like, that's not how it works. And I crack up every time I see that one. But this also does lead to a nice reunion between Kinemon and Momonosuke finally, and this seems to be the catalyst to allow Momo the ability to change back into his human form. So this killed my initial theory that maybe the flaw in the fruit that Vegapunk had created was that the user couldn't change back into their human form. I remember there were a lot of different theories thrown around, like it could be like a harder to control fruit, or maybe it didn't have any actual powers, or it's a weak fruit in terms of power output compared to the original one, or maybe it's not as powerful in terms of strength in compared to the genuine devil fruit, right down to like also things were mentioned like very superficial things like it's a smaller dragon compared to like the regular one, or maybe the color or the shape of it is off. There were a lot of theories thrown around at this time, but it is pretty funny to go back and see what people thought now, knowing what the flaw actually is as of the Egghead Island arc. And now circling back to the kids and Nami, this leads into one of my favorite moments of this arc, and that's Nami talking about handing the kids over to Tashigi and the Marines. And this is a really lovely scene as Nami talks of how she entrusted the kids to Tashigi because she has a weak spot for strong Marine women, reminiscing about her own mom, Bellemere, and it seems she sees a lot of those traits in Tashigi, and I particularly love the facial expression that Nami has here because it's not one we ever really get to see. This sort of really warm and loving yet somewhat somber expression as she stares smiling out to the sea as she explains to Usopp what her intentions are for the kids. And the kids, after they're informed that the Marines will be taking care of them, it's a real bummer for them and a disappointment for all. And because they've grown really fond of the Straw Hats, and it's just really funny yet poignant that they prefer pirates to the Marines, coming first full circle with the theme of this arc, that it doesn't matter what you are, it's your actions that define you. But you and I all know that they're all in good hands with Tashigi and Smoker. And this scene just gives me sort of the warm, fuzzy feelings all over, which is why I love this. And kind of continuing on with that warm, fuzzy feeling, the following scene where Momo and Kinemon eat is an incredible one. The pain and emotion that you see from the two of them is something else. Momo, upon seeing the food, still refuses to eat due to his bushy warrior pride, and attempts to throw the soup away when Sanji stops him because, of course, he's never going to let food go to waste, and scolds him. But Kinemon, to show Momo that it's okay to receive help from them, proceeds to break down crying as he stuffs his face with food. It's clear that they have been through a great deal up till now, not being able to trust anyone but themselves. And it's especially clear that they still have nakama that are still missing and also worried about their safety as well. And of course, this will get expanded on later on as we go through the story. And I remember I got really emotional at this scene when I first read it. And the anime also nails this scene as well with the voice acting and the music. But upon rewatch, this scene hits even that much harder after you learn the true struggles that they have gone through up till this point. I'll discuss this moment in further detail in the spoiler section, but for now, I love this scene because you really feel for Kinemon, and especially Momo, who's only a kid and has had to endure that much pain, suffering, and trauma already. The beauty of this scene is that it's built up since the beginning of the arc, ever since we were introduced to Kinemon's ass, and seeing how distrusting they both were of pirates and the Straw Hats, while also staying true to their customs of portraying staunch strength and self-reliance to an almost absurd degree, while both of them clearly in distress the whole time. Seeing them grit their way through the entire arc despite their constant pain and suffering is really admirable and incredibly endearing as you get further along the arc. And so when you see this finally paid off and we all get that emotional relief along with the two of them, you really feel the weight of it as it comes crashing down, and you can't help but tear up a little bit as their tears streaming down their faces and eating finally. Honestly, the hits with this episode just keep coming with the whole banquet and the entire encapsulation of what Law and Luffy's alliance is going to be. Law being all serious and cautious about the fact that they need to get out of there before more reinforcements come, while Luffy's biggest takeaway from that warning is that they need to hurry up and have their banquet. And Law's face here is absolutely hilarious. Up till now, this guy has been the definition of tough edgelord, and even he can't believe what he's witnessing as Luffy and everyone indulging in a much-needed joyful party. And the face he makes is priceless because we have never seen Law this much out of his tough guy persona, and it's just really funny to see Law slowly get turned by Luffy. I just really like this scene because for Law it shows just what kind of a pirate crew the Straw Hats are, where they can bring together so many different people that don't necessarily belong together, and it's a really touching moment. I mean, think about it. You have pirates, little kids, Wano, samurais, marines, and former enemies all partying together. This is pretty much what it's all about. Like, as we've talked about during many past arcs, Oda has always stated that the banquet at the end of each arc is some of his favorite moments to draw. And it's important that each arc have one. There are also some of my favorite moments too, and Luffy bringing joy and laughter to Momo who's crying is what his character is all about. This one in particular, I really like because of just how much each one of these groups have just gone through. Some of my other favorite banquets are Skypia is another one that I really love in terms of the banquets. I mean, they're all really great, but I think Skypia and Punk Hazard kind of stand out, at least up till now. Of course, we'll talk more about some of the future ones as well. One tiny translator's note on the Crunchyroll subs during Smoker and Law's conversation, where Smoker asks him what he's planning on using the Straw Hats for, and in the subs, Law responds, maybe he's taking advantage of me, but in Japanese, I'd say the more accurate translation is, I wonder who's taking advantage of who. It's not a big change, nor changes sort of the intent of the line, but I find it's a more natural translation than what was actually used in the Crunchyroll subs. Another interesting fun fact about this scene is that Law mentions to Smoker that he plans on going to Greenbit Island next. However, later on, he specifically mentions Dressrosa is their next destination. So what happened here? It's pretty well known at this point that Oda over the years has had so many ideas that it keeps extending the series. And sometimes, to rein him in, Oda's editors at Jump have had to step in and tell Oda that he's going to need to cut down on some stuff in order to not make the story continue for longer than it already has, as if it wasn't already really long at this point. But if Oda were left to his own devices, it would be even longer. So from interviews, it's said that Dressrosa and Greenbit were actually conceived as two separate islands with their own separate arcs, but instead his editors convinced him to combine the two. So when you see the structure of Dressrosa, you will see Greenbit is part of the Dressrosa kingdom. And I believe this change was made after Law said this in the manga, but I don't know why they didn't just adjust for this in the anime, because this would have already been decided prior to the anime being animated. So yeah, I'm not sure why that was left in, but I mean, seeing the events that do happen in Dressrosa, it doesn't really contradict anything he says here, so maybe that's why they just kept it as is. It's also in this same scene, we get a flashback and finally get to hear the portion of Nami, Luffy, and Law's conversation on the mountain from the midpoint of the arc about the Yonko Emperor they're going after first. And it is none other than Kaido, the emperor that is said to be the strongest of the remaining four. And there's also a curious portion about how Law calls him a creature, and Nami even makes a note to say he's not even human, which at the time made people think what kind of species Kaido was, which added even more to his already growing notoriety and hype. This fact, paired with the fact that he calls his crew the Beast Pirates, adds even more fuel to that fire that he is something more than man. Luffy, of course, hearing all this, is completely on board as long as they save Shanks for last, as Luffy's goal is to take them all down, which shouldn't be any surprise to us, since in order to become the Pirate King, he needs to be above everyone else, including the Yonko. But it's still cool and goosebump inducing that he's ready to declare this out loud and actually set that train in motion. And I think if you were paying attention throughout the arc, you could have deduced that this was Law's intention, was to take down the SAD plant and the Smile Fruit production, which was being sent to Doflamingo, who in turn sold that to someone, and the biggest buyer of that was inevitably going to be Kaido. So if we wanted to disrupt this process in service of taking down an emperor, it pretty much had to be Kaido. I think Oda meant to misdirect us into thinking that it was going to be Big Mom by showing us, the two main representatives for Big Mom so far were powerful zone type users in the form of Peckums and Baron Tamago during the end of the Fishman Island arc. And he further kept this fresh on our minds by repeatedly showing them as some of the brokers interested in buying the Shinokuni gas. Moving on, it's now time for the kids to be taken back home, but the G5 Marines, still trying to staunchly hold on to their rigid beliefs of justice, hold giant banners to prevent the kids from seeing the dirty pirates, quote unquote. And I love this scene, and this is the scene I was mentioning at the very beginning about how they needed to draw that line. And it shows that in response to their earlier conversation with Smoker about how the Marines shouldn't be put on a pedestal, lifted up as sort of an infallible ideal organization, they've come to realize that it's just not that black and white, and that there is far more nuance. They can see that now. Just because people are labeled pirates doesn't mean they're going to be bad people, just like if they're Marines doesn't automatically make them good. It's a theme that Oda's had pretty much since the start of the series, but he made it the central theme of an entire arc post time skip, no doubt to prepare us for that fact as more and more characters will begin to have those lines blurred, knowing the future events. I think Oda was preparing us, the audience, to not fall into that same trap when it comes to other Marine and other characters. Specifically with the Marine characters, it's almost like a meta way of Oda reminding us that not all Marines should automatically be assumed to be evil or bad people as well. Of course, that's kind of getting more into spoiler territory, so I'm not necessarily going to go deeper into that here, but I will mention it and touch upon it in the spoiler section. This is honestly a really emotional and well done scene because it's clear that the G5 Marines are way overcompensating for the fact that they have fallen in love with the Straw Hats along with the kids and quite bring themselves to admit that they really like and are grateful for this pirate crew that they're supposed to hate, which is why they had to draw that line. They needed some form of an outward way of separating themselves because without it, they would definitely fall into that category of being, really fans of them. And while it seems the soldiers aren't quite there yet, it seems that Tashigi and Smoker are. Tashigi, seeing all this, scolds them all, but the truth comes out that that's exactly what was happening. The cherry on top for me was also seeing the emotional reactions from the Punk Hazard guards, also being moved to tears by this display of emotions, as well as Momo and Kinamon's shocked reaction to this, because we know from their conversations that both of them really hate pirates. And so seeing pirates being lauded and loved by everyone and anyone, whether that be innocent children to hardened criminals and pirates and even tough Marine soldiers, it was quite a shock to them. Smoker, for his part, being the secret softy that he is, allows Brownbeard to go back into the lab later on to find and save his crew. And I personally love moments like this, seeing acts of kindness even to people who have done some, slightly bad things, showing them kindness, which then translates to hopefully reforming them. Smoker, despite his incredibly stern and tough attitude, is incredibly merciful, and he's only growing even more so with his continued exposure to Luffy and the Straw Hats. And it's really fun to see, despite the fact he keeps getting his ass kicked, which we are about to see happen again, unfortunately, which we'll get into in a second. But to close this out, the moment as they're shipping off, the kids yell back when they grow up, they want to become pirates. It's so funny, but also significant in the sense that they've just inherited the will of Roger as well. The will to become good pirates. That is more focused on spreading freedom and joy rather than, violence and plundering. Roger passed down that will to Shanks. Shanks then in turn passed that will down to Luffy. And now Luffy has passed that will down to these kids, along with countless other kids he's come across so far, which was also another huge thing on Fishman Island in the arc just prior to this, as we saw all those little kids in the Goncourt Square be influenced by Luffy's heroic actions, as well as all the other kids that he's encountered pre-time skip as well. Well, now that the kids are also safely away, the Straw Hats and everyone also decide to ship out as well, and later on, back on the Sunny, everyone gets up to speed about the fact that they are now in an alliance with Law, and that their goal is to take down a Yonko, to which we get Sanji also now warning Law that Luffy's definition of an alliance is probably pretty different to what he's thinking it is, which I also find funny and hilarious that not only did Usopp warn Law, now Sanji is also warning Law about just what he's actually getting himself into, which I find hilarious. Now, this set of episodes ends with a scene where Doflamingo happens upon a life raft with the severed heads of Baby Five and Buffalo. Don't worry, it's not as grim as it sounds. Along with a Dendemushi connected to Law waiting for him, and presents him with the terms of what he wants from Doflamingo in order to get Caesar back, which is to resign as a Shichibukai. And this makes Doflamingo sweat and get angrier than we have ever seen him. This was significant because up till now, Dofi has always been presented as a pretty aloof and always in control person, but this is their first time we've ever seen him visibly distressed and on the back foot, as the threat of having Kaido bearing down on him seems to scare the shit out of him legitimately. Which again, Oda is doing an amazing job laying the seeds for just how insane of a challenge that facing Kaido will be. that someone like Doflamingo is scared. The idea that the scariest villain we've been introduced to up till now is now scared of someone else shows just how much power Kaido actually possesses. This has been Law's plan all along, is to take down not only Doflamingo, who he seems to have a very unpleasant history with, but also Kaido by attempting to pit them against each other, which is pretty smart when you think about it. Now incredibly pissed and desperate, Doflamingo makes his way to Punk Hazard and arrives with a bang, as it's revealed he too possesses Conqueror's Haki, which is pretty much no surprise to really anyone, as he knocks out several of the weaker G5 Marines. Then in a terrifying display of his power, he makes several of them shoot each other with his trademark control-type powers, or his strings, as we later find out. However, as I mentioned in the differences section, if you read the manga, this part is very different, as Doflamingo actually uses his powers to slice up the soldiers, and it's even shown how he's doing it. It's the result of the strings he's controlling. The anime does start showing the strings a tiny bit when he's fighting Smoker, though. Although the anime tries to make it seem like Smoker lost because he was trying to protect his men, in the manga it's strongly implied he just straight up loses in one hit and stood no chance. Smoker is beaten badly, with Doflamingo sitting on him ready to execute him. And I knew Smoker wasn't going to die here, but I had no idea what or who was going to save him, because I completely forgot about Kuzan. And then you hear that arara, and chills run down your body, figuratively and literally, as none other than Kuzan shows up to save him. And there is something cold about that shot, pun intended, and panel of Kuzan shrouded in shadows and sort of the frosty ice smoke, with his sunglasses glowing white, towering over Doflamingo, who's huge in his own right. It's such an iconic shot that everyone remembers this shot of just Kuzan just like bearing down on Doflamingo, and Doflamingo is also pretty scared at this point because he just stops and freezes, again pun intended. And this episode and the chapter cliffhanger was so hype because we were all wondering on the edge of our seat, is Doflamingo and a former admiral in Kuzan, are they gonna throw down in a battle? And yeah, we were all pretty excited at the time. I remember, at least I was hugely excited to see what would happen between the two of these people, and whether it would be a huge battle with characters on this type of level going up against each other. It's basically like Marineford, kind of on a smaller scale. But unfortunately, we won't find out until the next episode, because that's where these sets end. But yeah, if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment, and if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram at SunnyGo Podcast if you want updates of when I post new episodes, and to see pictures of my manga collection and card collection. And like I've always said, liking and subscribing is much appreciated, and also just listening to the podcast is enough for me. But if you feel like supporting me a little extra, feel free to support my Buy Me a Coffee profile found on the website. But yeah, obviously it's not required. As always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to my podcast. Small spoiler section, well, actually it might be a medium-sized one. But if you're not interested in that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye! Alrighty, spoiler section. So yeah, like always, this is a little bit more kind of off the cuff, unscripted. But yeah, there's about three things that I wanted to really talk about. One is sort of the meta interpretation of how Oda is kind of preparing us not to assume the qualities of characters based on their affiliations, because we do see a couple different sort of changes in unexpected characters. So, mainly, I guess that for now I want to focus on Fujitora or Issho, and Kuzan and Kanjuro. So like Fujitora, he's introduced as one of the new admirals that took over both Akainu and Aokiji's spots. And Fujitora, like, clearly he is a good man. He definitely, while he is a Marine admiral, he's definitely not as, vicious as Akainu, and he's not quite the company man, clearly, as Kizaru. And so Fujitora, despite him being a Marine admiral, he is actually an incredibly good and honorable man, to the point where he actually stands up to Akainu when he doesn't agree with how he does things. And so, yeah, Fujitora is the first example of that. Kuzan is obviously a really interesting case because Kuzan obviously going from a Marine admiral to a free agent, then being recruited and joining the Blackbeard pirates. This seemingly good man joins basically the final end boss of One Piece, like the main villain group, is very unexpected. But again, like I mentioned in a past spoiler section, I don't think Kuzan is actually truly an evil person or trying to be evil. I think there is a very good reason why he's joined up with the Blackbeard pirates, and I think ultimately he will be a good, a force for good, and a force for something that will be on the side of the good characters, whether it be the Straw Hats or just all the the good army in the end. Kanjuro is another one that really surprises you because obviously we're presented with that twist where Kanjuro is seen as a very loyal friend to Kinemon, Momo, and Raizo, and they all join together and trying to find help to save Wano. But then it turns out that he is a traitor, and so yeah, it's like all these different elements that come together of people. We assume that they're one thing because of their affiliations, but in actuality, they all turned out to be very different. And so I think this arc was set up in a way where Oda wanted to sort of prime us for these types of characters and situations, which I think was pretty cool actually. Because yeah, while this theme has always been present throughout the entirety of One Piece, like it's pretty much present in some fashion in every arc up till now. But I think it's good that he actually took the time to explicitly explore this theme as being the central theme of an entire arc, which then primes us for this. Now, the second thing I wanted to talk about is a very small moment, and that is when Momonosuke is presented with the food and he freaks out and tries to throw the soup in particular. And there's this moment where both in the manga and the anime where he stares right at the soup. And, at first, you're meant to take this scene as Momonosuke doesn't want pity or mercy or help, and that's why he's refusing to eat the food, and he tries to throw it. But the fact that he stares at the soup first for a long time, and Oda makes sure that we look at the soup, and then that's the thing he chooses to throw away. I think, even though Momo wasn't there for the oil boiling of his father, Oden, he knew what was happening because, when you go back and read that chapter, you see that Momo seems to understand what is happening, even though he's at the castle and he refuses to eat. And then it cuts to the next panel is literally a huge shot, a half-page shot of this big bowl of oil, boiling oil. And so I think at some point either Momo put together what happened to his father, or maybe even Kinemon or Kanjuro or Raizo told him what happened, in probably, hopefully not in gruesome detail, but I think Momo knew what had happened to his father, and so seeing this hot bowl of soup plus the cauldron, that massive cauldron that Brook and Sanji were using to prepare the soup, probably reminded him of his father's horrific death, which also triggered a trauma response by Momonosuke. And when you look at that from that perspective, it makes this scene so much sadder, because when you really think about it, in their timeline, that whole experience of their father or his father being executed, having to go on the run, seeing his home burned down, and being sent to the future, all of that's only happened in probably the span of a week. So all of this is really fresh on both of their minds. And yeah, when you watch this scene after seeing the events of Wano and Oden's flashback, this scene hits so much harder. Why they're so emotional and why they're so in tears over this. And also, when you think about it too, Momo hasn't eaten since that day. Like he had that food staring in front of him, and he refused to eat it when he was at the castle because he knew that his father was about to be executed. And so Momonosuke hasn't eaten in forever. So this has been a really trying time for him. And so seeing this scene with that context really changes it from like an emotional one to like, oh my God, like what have these two been through? And similarly on that sort of note is that the third and last thing I wanted to kind of talk about in this spoiler section is Law healing the kids. That also hits so much harder considering after seeing his flashback and his childhood and his own battle with his disease and seeing, you know, what Rocinante went through to save Law, and the whole purpose of him getting that fruit was so that he could cure himself. And I think, you know, obviously Law, it means a lot to him for him to be able to use that ability to help heal other kids. And so, yeah, that scene also hits a lot harder, knowing what Law had to go through himself as a sick child who was basically doomed by all these other doctors. And now that he has the power, and thanks to Rocinante giving up his life to get him that power, it's really, it's a really significant moment that he uses that power now to help kids, especially. So I really love that scene. Like, and again, that's one of the reasons why One Piece is so cool, like especially on Rewatch too, because so many things that happen later on make these scenes in the past that much better, knowing like the context behind it. And it's amazing how he keeps enhancing things with future events when watching past events. It's really cool, and it's one of my favorite things about rewatching One Piece and getting a new understanding of different moments, different character motivations, and in different like perspectives on certain events. But anyways, those are the things that I wanted to talk about in the spoiler section. So if you stuck around for that, thank you. And yeah, I'll see you on the next episode. See ya.